you so much. We're going to do a lot of show and tell today, and we're going to start with a very familiar face. This is Sarah Palin, who is speaking here at the 2010 National Rifle Association Annual Convention to 80,000 people, and her speech was really remarkable for many things, but the thing that I found most striking was the way she opened it, which was by telling redneck jokes. She said, "I'm not ashamed of being called a redneck. That's who I am." She said, "Redneck jokes aren't funny. They're me. They really are. What did they do? Read my diary or something?" So there's Sarah Palin as the NRA's poster girl. She was joined by Glenn Beck, who was the keynote speaker at the convention. And what he stressed was that the nation now needed a well-regulated militia, saying these are not Democrats, they are revolutionary Marxists in the Obama administration. He said that Obama has a deep-seated hatred for white people and has promoted the theories of the right-wing extremist group, the John Birch Society. So this is really the face of the NRA today. It's an assortment of far right-wing politicians. Yet at the same time, if you go to the NRA's website, which I know 32 people in this room have done, you will find that the NRA also promotes itself as a civil rights organization and promotes gun rights as civil rights. And I would actually encourage everyone in this room who's interested to go to that NRA website, because if you go to their articles and the articles they link to, you'll see a fascinating history of racist gun laws in this country dating back to the 17th century, before this even was a country, dating back to the Virginia colonies, going all the way up through the 19th century. And the NRA does see gun rights as civil rights, and Sarah Palin has said, and I'm going to have to read this quote because it's a little convoluted. She says, "Our Second Amendment rights, they are so important, especially to women and to minorities, because we know that the right to bear arms protects those who some would perceive as weak. The weak against the strong are protected. It's like the old saying, God made men and women, but Colonel Colt made them equal." And indeed, the NRA is right that gun rights are a civil rights issue, and they're right that there is a long history not just of unjust gun laws, which discriminate against African Americans and other minorities, but that there is a long history of African Americans engaging in armed self-defense. This is actually John Mitchell, who was the editor of the oldest African American newspaper in this country, the Richmond Planet, from right here, who has said that in 1886, the best remedy for a lyncher or a cursed midnight rider is a 16-shot Winchester in the hands of a dead-shot Negro who has nerve enough to pull the trigger. And gun rights writers writing about civil rights often invoke stories like Daisy Bates, who was the Arkansas NAACP leader during the time of the high school integration in Little Rock, and who was protected, as she wrote in her memoir later, by a group of armed men who were stationed outside her house every night. And the NRA applauds this as a necessary thing. And they applauded the Deacons of Defense, which was a Mississippi group founded in 1964 and very active through 1965, which was founded in Jonesboro, Mississippi, after a group of night riders went down the main street of the town escorted by the police. So this was a group of 100 plus African Americans. They were always very vague about their membership numbers, who defended themselves with guns. And can anyone guess where they got their ammunition from, by the way? Anyone? The NRA at that time had a free ammunition program to riflery clubs, free and reduced price. They got all this government surplus ammunition, and they would hand it out to groups that were interested, including the Deacons for Defense. This is Leader Robert Williams teaching his wife Michelle how to shoot. So this is another group that the NRA promotes on its website and by its writers. But when you look at the NRA membership today, this is another shot from the convention, you see all white faces. The NRA is essentially an all-white organization promoting guns as a black civil rights issue. And if you look more closely at their website, you'll see that there is one group that they don't mention at all, and we'll get to that. Now, Sarah Palin and Glenn Beck may be the faces of the NRA today, but the NRA did not start as a right-wing extremist organization. It started as a riflery club in 1871, and for a long time, its focus was really on sport. The NRA promoted groups like this 1922 Washington, D.C. high school girls riflery club. They promoted riflery groups all over the country and trained them, gave them ammunition. And when they opened their new headquarters in 1958, their motto, which is not the motto of the NRA, was right above the door. It was firearms safety education, marksmanship training, and shooting for recreation. One single event changed the NRA's focus from teaching policemen how to shoot to focusing on gun control laws. And this was it. Lee Harvey Oswald, when he assassinated Kennedy, actually ordered his rifle through the mail using a fake name and using a coupon from the NRA's magazine, American Rifleman. And this fact was enough to alarm Congress, so that in the weeks after the Kennedy assassination, over 17 federal gun control laws were proposed and over 170 gun control laws were proposed at the state level. The Kennedy assassination alarmed lawmakers and made them think for the first time that we really need to regulate guns much more closely. And this in turn alarmed the NRA. And now, as well, all of the police that the NRA had trained were in the position in the South of being seen as opponents to civil rights. Here we've got this very famous image of police dogs being set on civil rights protesters. Civil rights protesters, as you can see, are not fighting back because Martin Luther King and other activists at that time had decided that the public stance for civil rights activists needed to be nonviolence because that would show in glaring detail the discrepancy between the violence unleashed upon protesters by the state and their response to it. And as Eric Severai noted on the evening news, a snarling police dog set upon a human being is recorded in the permanent photoelectric file of every human being's brain. So, in other words, the police were now in the position of being dramatized as antagonists, setting upon civil rights protesters who were not fighting back. Of course, not every civil rights activist took this position. In fact, in private, many civil rights activists were gun owners, did arm themselves, and saw the need for armed self-defense. And after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in 1963, where 4 little black girls were killed, in fact, the black community of Birmingham was so heavily armed that the FBI refused to drive Assistant Attorney General Marshall through a black neighborhood because they were so afraid of armed blacks in that neighborhood. And the Assistant Attorney General had to be driven there by a black armed self-defense group instead. So you had law enforcement terrified of armed blacks, civil rights activists enacting the theater of nonviolence very, very effectively to get their political needs met and to alarm the American public. And you also had black leaders like Malcolm X beginning to say, this isn't going to work. In 1964, he argued that when the government has proven itself unwilling or unable to defend the lives and property of Negroes, it's time for Negroes to defend themselves. Article number 2 of the constitutional amendments provides you and me the right to own a rifle or shotgun. If the white man doesn't want the black man buying rifles or shotguns, then let the government do its job. That's all. Of course, Malcolm X was representing the Nation of Islam, which was not identified as an American nationalist group, right? It was the Nation of Islam, not the United States, that he was a spokesperson for. So, this moment, you've got intense white fear of armed blacks. You've got black spokespeople like Malcolm X publicly coming out in favor of gun ownership for the African American community. And you have something new as well, which is you have the Vietnam War beginning to amp up at this point. And in the Vietnam War, you have an overrepresentation of African Americans in the military compared to the population at large. And of course, the military had only been integrated fairly recently, right, when Truman integrated the military. So you had the armed services recruiting African Americans in large numbers. I love this poster, your son can be black and Navy too. But this was gun ownership on a very different level. This is gun ownership in the military. The Black Panthers, the only group, prominent armed black self-defense group not mentioned on the NRA's website, changed all of this. Founded in 1966 as an outgrowth of and response to earlier civil rights groups in the South, the Black Panthers had a 10-point platform, the 7th point of which had to do with gun ownership and for the need of every black person to own a gun. They were not a large group in 1966. They did not come to prominence until 1967 when Representative Mulford, who was a California state assemblyman from Oakland, from a different part of Oakland than the Black Panthers were from, became alarmed at their custom of armed patrols in the black community. Because the Black Panthers had a practice which is mind-blowing when you think of it now, of following the police around their neighborhood when they were on patrols with their squad cars, and the Black Panthers would come armed with loaded rifles, law books, cameras, and tape recorders, so that if they were confronted by the cops, they would cite chapter and verse of the law which enabled them to carry loaded weapons. Of course, Assemblyman Mulford wanted to change all of this. He had a law that he proposed, and it was called the Panther Law. It was specifically directed against the Black Panthers, and the goal of this law was to prohibit carrying loaded weapons in public spaces in California. On May 2nd, 1967, the Black Panthers called the media, and depends on who you read, I think the most accurate number is 24 male and 6 female Black Panthers marched on the California state capitol and went right into the assembly room carrying their weapons. And you can see this event was very, very well documented, because when they called up the media and said, we are sending a bunch of armed Black Panthers into the California State Assembly, reporters came running. What the reporters did not document at this time was that there were also white NRA members there. White gun rights advocates who were protesting at the same time in the same space, but are really not in any of the pictures, because having a white gun rights group was not seen as nearly as inflammatory as the spectacle of young Black men with weapons. The Black Panthers took armed self-determination and their constitutional rights very, very seriously. And when they said that every member of the Black community should be armed, they meant also women. And here's a poster that I love by Panther propaganda minister Emory Douglas of an armed baby, a baby with a handgun. And while the Panthers at home were advocating for greater Black gun ownership, Black soldiers in Vietnam were also becoming more militant, especially in the wake of the King assassination. For the Panthers, after all, self-defense was a must. And the self-defense was very specifically geared against the police. I don't know how good your eyes are, so I'll read this for you. Here's a cartoon from a Black Panther newspaper. It says, "You're a man, you see, and a man must be whatever he'll be, or he won't be free. If he's bound up tight, he'll hold back the night, and there won't be no light for day. Well then, believe it, my friend, that the silence will end. We'll just have to get guns and be men." Ironically enough, written by a woman, Elaine Brown, who was the only major female Black Panther leader, I believe, the whole National Party. But here you see a panther wielding his gun against a pig, right? The Panthers, of course, had reason to be concerned about police violence. This is Black Panther leader Fred Hampton of Chicago, who was killed. I found the least graphic photo I could. This was the scene of his death after the FBI and Chicago police came in and fired a volley of 99 bullets to one single bullet fired by the Black Panthers, killing both Fred Hampton and Black Panther Mark Clark. So there was extensive police violence against the Panthers, and the Panthers fought back. It was part of all power to the people, as their leader Hugh Newman would say. The police, by the same token, used the Panthers, I don't want to say gun fetishism, but their strong interest in guns and weaponry and their insistence on their constitutional rights to carry weapons. They used this very effectively in their own propaganda campaigns. This was a cache of Panther weapons that was seized in one Oakland raid, and cops around the country used the same image over and over and over again whenever they wanted to get audiences of any kind stirred up about the specter of armed Black Panthers. And much of their art, most of their art, in fact, features this icon of the armed Black Panther ready to free the people through violence. So that brings us back to the NRA today. And the question that I want to come to, and the question that I want to start a discussion with, is how is it possible for the National Rifle Association to balance this history, the history of unjust gun laws, and their current far-right white membership? Is gun rights a civil rights issue? And if gun rights is a civil rights issue, how is it possible for the National Rifle Association to completely divide the history of the American group that is most heavily concerned with gun rights as a civil rights issue, and that's the Black Panthers? Because while Malcolm X certainly believed in armed self-determination and the need of the Black community to defend itself against police violence, he was also very, very explicit that his community was not the American community per se. Black Panthers were looking to reclaim American identity. And for them, as for I would suspect many people in this room, American identity and the right to bear arms are very, very closely tied together. And that's the crux of the problem that the NRA now has with civil rights history. How is it possible to balance the militant tradition, the tradition of civil rights activists arming themselves against Klan and police violence, the NRA's long tradition of providing firearms training to the police, and the current membership of the NRA, which, as you could see, is almost entirely white? How do we fit this all together seamlessly or not seamlessly? And I would love to hear your thoughts about this, especially those of you who have been thinking about this because you've been reading about this. How do these things fit together? Is it possible for the NRA to take this position, or is the NRA going to, is it ultimately self-contradictory? Is it possible for an organization to align itself with Glenn Beck, with Sarah Palin, who is proud to be a redneck, and with the Deacons of Defense, this Black armed self-defense group from mid-1960s Mississippi? What is the natural consequence of that? If you go to the NRA website and if you read around in gun rights literature, you will see that a lot of the literature is geared towards the theory that Americans cannot rely on the police to protect them. If you look at NRA articles that are written with women in mind, all of the articles are about, and the NRA has a monthly column in American Rifleman on this issue. It's called Armed Citizen. Citizens need to arm themselves because the police will not be there to protect them. Women are going to be stalked by ex-husbands, ex-boyfriends, rapists, strangers in parking lots. They need to have a handgun in their purse. There are communities who can't protect themselves. So how do we balance this against the militants of the Black Panthers? Because clearly the conservative Republicans in the NRA today are not going to be happy to align themselves with the Black Panthers. How do we make this work? Is it possible to make it work?